The most precise revenge does not announce itself. In this story, the protagonist's first move after rebirth is not a confrontation, it is a donation receipt. She removes the object of envy before the game even begins. That single act of preemptive silence tells you everything about how she plays. Welcome to Eternal Diary. The smell of dying carnations was the last thing Nina Leung registered before she woke up wrong. Not wrong in the way of nightmares, where the body jolts and the heart runs ahead of the brain. Wrong in the way of calendars. The specific, nauseating wrongness of existing in a date you have already lived through, already bled through, already buried. The flowers were from the cheap arrangement on her old nightstand, the one she'd bought at the corner stall near her first apartment when she was 24, and still believed in making a space feel like home, regardless of whether anyone else would ever see it. Pale pink carnations, 72 cents per stem. She had bought 7 of them. She knew this because she was lying in that apartment right now. Not her current apartment. Not the sleek, silent box on the 31st floor that she had spent 4 years furnishing with the careful deliberateness of a woman who no longer trusted anyone to share space with her. This was the older one, the one with the rattling radiator and the window that only opened halfway, and the landlord who left maintenance requests unanswered for 6 weeks before responding with a photo of his dog as though that constituted communication. She was 24 years old. Nina did not scream. She did not reach for her phone in a panic or run to the bathroom to stare at her face in the mirror the way a lesser version of herself might have. She lay very still in the narrow bed with the carnations going brown at the edges on the nightstand, and she breathed, and she counted backward. She was 24. The year was 2017. She had died at 31. Not dramatically, not in a car wreck or a fire or any of the cinematic exits that might have softened the humiliation of it. She had died in a hospital bed in the cardiac ward of Renhe Medical Center, wearing a paper gown that kept slipping off her left shoulder, while the monitor beside her produced a sound that her nurses later described to each other in the hallway as unexpectedly peaceful. Myocarditis, secondary to an autoimmune cascade that her doctors had been monitoring for 2 years, and her sister had known about for 3. The stress, they told the family afterward, was a contributing factor. Chronic, unmanaged stress. She had known, lying in that bed with the paper gown sliding, exactly what the stress was. Now she lay in the apartment that smelled of carnations and old radiator heat, and the particular musk of a woman 24 years old who still ironed her work blouses on a folding board because she couldn't afford a proper ironing board. And she began, very quietly, to think. The thing about dying young, the thing no one tells you, which because no one comes back to report it, is that it clarifies. Everything that felt complicated in living becomes elementary in death. Every excuse you made for people, every charitable interpretation you extended, every moment you chose to believe the best because believing the worst was too exhausting, all of it burns away. What remains is the architecture. The actual structure of what happened, stripped of sentiment, standing in clean, cold lines like a building after a fire. But Nina understood the architecture now. She had 7 years. 7 years between this mattress and the hospital bed. 7 years in which every significant loss of her adult life would occur in sequence, with the reliability of a schedule she had already memorized. She knew the dates, she knew the names, she knew which phone calls to ignore, which contracts to read twice, which rooms to never enter alone, and which person would stand at her bedside in year 7, holding her hand with an expression of practiced grief, while her phone battery died unreplaced in the hospital locker 2 rooms away. Her sister's name was Cora. Nina got out of bed. She moved through the small apartment in the gray pre-dawn light with the efficiency of someone navigating a space they know in the dark, because she did know it in the dark. She had lived here for 11 months the first time, as between 24 and 25, before she'd saved enough to move somewhere with a window that opened fully and a landlord who returned calls. She put on the kettle. She found the instant coffee she had not bought yet in this timeline and registered that she had apparently purchased it in the 3 days following her 24th birthday, which she did not remember doing and which now struck her as both mundane and faintly heartbreaking. The way all evidence of your own ordinary persistence tends to strike you when viewed from a distance. She stood at the small kitchen window with the coffee going cold in her hands and looked at the building across the alley, its windows still dark, and began to reconstruct the problem. Cora Liang was her half-sister. This was a fact Nina had taken many years to say plainly, without the social cushioning that the word half usually invited people to add on her behalf. They shared a father, Richard Liang, founder of Liang Property Development, a mid-sized real estate holding company whose portfolio was modest by industry standards, but whose cash reserves, Nina had eventually discovered, were far from modest. Richard Liang was the kind of man who kept 2 sets of books, not because he was criminal, but because he was constitutionally incapable of believing that transparency served any useful purpose. He had married twice. Nina's mother, Faye, had died when Nina was 9. Richard had married Helen 6 months later, with the speed of a man executing a decision he'd made long before the circumstances made it officially available. Helen had brought Cora. Cora was 3 years younger than Nina, which in childhood had meant Nina was responsible for her, and in adulthood had meant Cora was owed things. This was the logic Helen had maintained across 2 decades. With the consistency of a woman who had identified a single argument and intended to use it for life. The logic held that Nina, being older, had received more of their father's time and resources in the formative years. The logic held that Cora, being younger, had been disadvantaged by circumstance. The logic held that equity, therefore, required ongoing redistribution from Nina to Cora in perpetuity, calibrated entirely by Helen's assessment of what Cora currently required. Nina had been 23 before she understood that this logic was not a family philosophy, but a financial strategy. She had been 27 before she understood it was also a legal strategy. She had been 30 before she understood how completely it had worked. And now she was 24, standing at a kitchen window with cold coffee, and she had 7 years, and she was going to do something entirely different. The leather boots were in the closet. She didn't look at them immediately. When she finished the coffee, she showered, she put on the work clothes she recognized from her first time through this day. The gray blazer, the dark trousers, the low heels that she'd bought on sale and worn until the lining cracked, because at 24 she was still in the phase of her career where investment pieces meant things she bought at 40% off and made last for 4 years by rotating them carefully. She ate half a piece of toast because that was what she had in the apartment. And she thought, and she planned, and then she went to the closet. The boots were on the second shelf, wrapped in their original tissue paper, sitting inside a brown paper bag from the shop on Huahai Road, where she'd bought them with the first real discretionary money she'd ever had. Not her salary. She'd been working since she was 18, part-time through university and full-time after graduation. And all of that money had gone toward tuition supplements and rent in the quiet. Our necessary business of existing without her father's financial support, which she had stopped accepting at 22 because the conditions attached to it had become too expensive in a way that had nothing to do with money. The discretionary money was her first performance bonus from Keane and Partners, the mid-tier corporate law firm where she'd spent 3 years doing the kind of intensive, unglamorous groundwork that either makes lawyers or breaks them. She had bought the boots as a private ceremony. No one had been invited. She had gone alone on a Tuesday afternoon when the city was wet and cold and gray, and she had sat on the velvet bench in the shop and tried them on and looked at her feet and thought, I bought these myself. No one paid for these, no one can take credit for these. They are entirely mine. She had been wrong about the last part. She took the boots out of the tissue paper now, in this earlier morning. This reclaimed Tuesday 7 years before their eventual fate. She held them for a moment. They were beautiful. They were made of the kind of leather that deepens and softens with wear, rather than cracking, full-grain calfskin in a color that had been described on the shop's tag as cognac, but which was really closer to the dark amber of old whiskey in a glass against candlelight. They had a modest heel, 2 inches, not performative, and a clean, restrained silhouette that would still look correct in another decade. In her first life, she had worn them 14 times over 3 years before Cora had noticed them. Cora had borrowed them for one event, Nina's own engagement party, which was also the first time Nina had understood that Marcus Chen had been choosing Cora for considerably longer than he had been choosing Nina, and had returned them with a heel scrape on the left boot and no mention of it. and had smiled at Nina across the room that night with an expression that Nina had interpreted at the time as warmth, and now understood was satisfaction. Nina set the boots back down on the shelf. Then she went to her laptop, opened a browser, and found the address of the nearest donation center. It opened at 9. She spent the next 2 hours doing something she had not done in her first life at 24. That's because at 24, she'd had no reason to do it, and at 31, she'd been too ill to do it in time. She opened the company registry database and pulled up the public filing records for Liang Property Development, Limited. She knew what she was looking for. In her first life, she had found it accidentally at 29 while reviewing an unrelated estate matter for a client at the law firm where she'd eventually made associate. She had found a discrepancy in the original articles of incorporation, a name listed as co-founder that had been quietly removed in a filing amendment submitted in 2008. She had not, at 29, understood what that meant. She had mentioned it to her father over dinner in the offhand way of someone who finds an interesting footnote, and her father had changed the subject so smoothly and completely that she'd almost forgotten it. She had not forgotten it. She had simply filed it away in the part of her mind that had learned, over many years of being Richard Liang's older daughter, to note discrepancies and say nothing and wait for them to become legible. The name in the original 2003 Articles of Incorporation was Fei Wu Liang, her mother. The amendment removing the name was filed in October 2009. Nina would have been 16. Her mother had been dead for 7 years. The amendment had been signed by Richard Liang as sole director. Whilst it had also been witnessed by Helen Park Liang, who at that point had been legally Richard Liang's wife for 6 years, and who had, prior to marrying him, spent 4 years working as a paralegal in a corporate filing office. Nina looked at the witness signature on her laptop screen for a long time. Then she wrote down everything she needed to verify, organized it by priority and access difficulty, and closed the laptop. She put the boots in the donation bag. She added the rest of her shoe collection to the bag after a moment's consideration, not from sentimentality or despair, but from strategy. Cora's interest in Nina's possessions had always been the opening move, the initial incursion that established precedence. The boots were the first example Nina could recall in clean, unambiguous terms, but they had been preceded by a watch, 2 blazers, and a set of jade earrings that had belonged to their mother and which had gone missing from Nina's apartment during a period when Cora had a spare key for emergencies. Removing the objects removed the incursion point. It was not symbolic. It was operational. She paused at the closet with the donation bag in her hand and considered the mechanics of how Cora moved through the world. It was, in its way, impressive. The kind of aptitude that goes entirely unrecognized because it operates under the cover of warmth. Cora never asked for things. She noticed them. She commented on them with the specific warmth of someone who understands that admiration is the first stage of acquisition. You told her she couldn't possibly borrow the things she just complimented, and she nodded, entirely understanding. And you felt slightly churlish for having said so. And a week later, the thing was gone, and you were wondering whether you'd misplaced it. The jade earrings had been the clearest case. Nina had been 22 and had brought Cora up to her apartment to see the new place. This one, in fact, the apartment with the rattling radiator. And Cora had been 19 and had walked through every room with the interested attention of someone taking inventory, pausing at the small wooden box on Nina's dresser where the earrings lived. Nina had said, while Cora was looking at them, those were Mom's, and Cora had said, "They're beautiful." And then Cora had asked to use the bathroom, and Nina had gone to put the kettle on, and 2 months later, the earrings were not in the box. She had not confronted Cora. Not then, and not in any subsequent instance. Confrontation required acknowledging that the taking was intentional, and acknowledging that required the kind of family reckoning that she'd been trained, across years of Sunday dinners and family occasions, to understand as destructive, excessive, and the product of a mind that was unwilling to be charitable. The family's preferred interpretation was always the charitable one. Perhaps Cora had borrowed them intending to return them. Perhaps they had been misplaced. Perhaps Nina had moved them herself and forgotten. The charitable interpretations multiplied and compounded, and in their multiplication created a fog through which it became progressively harder to see the simple, clear shape of what was actually happening. She had lived in that fog for years. It had been warm. That was the thing about fog. It was warm. And the alternative was standing in cold clarity, And clarity had its costs. She was not interested in warmth right now. She was interested in the cold, clear alternative. She kept 2 pairs of practical shoes and her work heels. Everything else went into the bag. At 9:15, she dropped it at the donation center on Longshan Road and was given a receipt in the name of N. Liang, date-stamped, itemized. The volunteer at the desk had been a brisk woman in her 50s who had recorded the donation with the efficient neutrality of someone for whom other people's discarded objects were simply inventory. She had not looked at the boots in particular. She had not remarked on them. They had been received and processed and would be distributed without ceremony to whoever needed footwear, and the whole transaction had taken 4 minutes and produced a small thermal-printed slip of paper that Nina folded into her wallet behind her transit card. This was the right scale for it, she thought. 4 minutes, a thermal receipt, the appropriate weight for an object that had been, in her first life, assigned an enormous emotional charge simply because it had been the site where something became undeniable. Not the first instance, not the real wound, but the moment when the wound was visible to her at a point where she could no longer pretend she hadn't seen it. She had spent years assigning weight to objects in proportion to the moment of revelation they contained. The boots were not, in themselves, worth grief or strategy. They were leather and labor, well-made, replaceable. Among the revelation they had contained was, "Your sister does not respect what is yours," which was a true thing. But true things needed to be held at their actual scale, not at the scale of the moment you finally perceived them. She put the receipt in her wallet and went to work. And Kayan and Partners occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a building in the Jing'an district that had been constructed with the specific aesthetic intention of making everyone inside it feel slightly underdressed, regardless of what they were wearing. The lobby had the height of a cathedral and the warmth of a filing cabinet. The elevators played a string quartet that Nina had never identified, but which she had spent 6 years hearing, and 3 years after that occasionally catching herself humming in the shower, an experience that felt like a minor form of haunting. She knew this building well. She knew which partners were competent and which were credentialed. She knew which cases were genuinely important and which were billable hour exercises. She knew which of her colleagues would still be here in 5 years, and which were positioning themselves for exits that they would announce with varying degrees of performed reluctance. She knew all of this from having lived it once already, and the knowledge sat in her chest like ballast, heavy and stabilizing, a weight that kept her from being moved by things that had previously moved her. Her desk was in the Junior Associates section, owning a long open space divided by low partitions that provided the illusion of privacy and the reality of acoustic exposure. She had a window view only if she stood up. The person at the desk to her left was a man named Theo Park, who would in 3 years make a lateral move to a better firm with a signing bonus, and who in this present morning was eating a hard-boiled egg at his desk with the focused expression of a man who had decided that efficiency mattered more than atmosphere. Morning, Theo said, without looking up from the egg. Morning, Nina said, and sat down and opened her email and found the message she had been expecting. It was from the firm's managing partner, David Kian. It was addressed to all junior associates. It announced that the firm had been retained to provide advisory support to a new client in the property development sector, a family-owned company in the early stages of a portfolio restructuring. Or was the message noted that associates interested in the matter should indicate availability by end of day? In her first life, Nina had not indicated availability. She had been assigned to a different matter that week, a commercial lease dispute that was genuinely interesting in a technical sense, but which had kept her occupied through the precise window in which the property matter developed. By the time she understood what the property matter had contained, it was 2 years later, and the window had closed. She replied to David Kian's email before she finished reading it. The company was not Liang Property Development. It was a mid-sized competitor called Hangfeng Holdings, which Nina knew from her first life had been acquired by Liang Property in 2020, under terms that her father had subsequently described as favorable. She had not, at the time, interrogated what favorable meant from Hangfeng's perspective. She had simply registered the acquisition as another item in the general ledger of her family's expanding control over assets she had no formal stake in and no formal mechanism for challenging. She had that mechanism now, or rather, she was going to build it. David Kian called her into his office at 2 p.m. He was a careful man, dry in the way of people who have spent 30 years in corporate law and found that dryness is the most sustainable climate for the work. He had dark eyes behind metal-framed glasses that he took off and put back on throughout conversations as though testing whether the world looked different without them. "You've indicated interest in the Hengfeng matter," he said. "Yes," Nina said. She was sitting in the chair across from his bed with her hands in her lap, and she felt the particular steadiness that comes not from confidence, but from having already survived everything this room was capable of producing. "Oh, you're second-year junior," he said. "The matter involves significant structural analysis. I'd be putting you with Wei Shu, who leads the property group." "I know Wei Shu's work," Nina said. "The Dongfang refinancing in 2015, the Suzhou Commercial District matter last year." David Kean put his glasses back on. "You've been following his cases." "I've been following the property group," she said. It's where the most technically complex work in the firm is currently happening." This was both true and strategic. Wei Shu was also, Nina knew from her first life, the attorney who would eventually become the key outside counsel for Liang Property Development in 2022. He would be involved in the transaction in which a significant portion of Liang Property's residential portfolio was transferred to a holding vehicle co-controlled by Cora Liang and Edward Park, Cora's partner. AD, who was also the son of a major investor, and also the man Helen had been quietly introducing Cora to since Cora was 19 years old. Nina had found out about this transaction at 29, 2 years after it closed, when she was reviewing the same registry database for an unrelated matter. She had not been a party to it. She had not been informed of it. She had not been invited to any of the family conversations in which it was presumably discussed. Because by 27, she had learned that the Liang family conversations she was invited to were the ones in which she was intended to perform a specific function, usually the function of appearing supportive while something was done in the background that would, in time, consolidate the family's primary assets in the direction of Cora and away from Nina. "All right," David Kean said. "I'll put you on the Hengfeng matter. You'll be junior support to Wei Shu's team. This means due diligence. Document review, structure analysis. It's not glamorous at your level." "I understand," Nina said. "You'll also be the point of contact for client communication at the associate level, which means you'll be in client meetings. I'm telling you this in advance because some associates find client meetings destabilizing at the junior stage, and I'd rather know now if you're one of them." Nina looked at him steadily. "I won't be," she said. He put his glasses on again and looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "No," he said. "I don't think you will be." The Hengfeng matter was, on its surface, a corporate refinancing exercise. Hengfeng Holdings wanted to restructure its balance sheet in preparation for a potential sale. Not an unusual situation for a mid-sized property company in the current climate. Where consolidation was happening quickly, and the question was not whether you would be absorbed, but when, and at what valuation. The client was a man named Victor Shen, Hengfeng's founder and majority shareholder, who was 63 years old and tired in the way of men who have built something significant and are now principally occupied with ensuring that the act of divesting it does not undo what the act of building it accomplished. Nina met him in the conference room on the 14th floor, in a meeting that Wei Shu led and that she attended as the most junior person in the room, seated at the far end of the table, with a legal pad and a role that was technically observational. Victor Shen was compact, careful, and possessed of the kind of stillness that reads either as authority or exhaustion, depending on the observer. He had a son, Peter Shen, present at the meeting, perhaps 35. He's with the distracted energy of someone who has been told he is important to this process and has not yet decided whether the process is worth being important to. Nina watched Victor Shen and took careful notes and said nothing, and after the meeting, in the elevator, Wei Shu looked at her notepad and said, "You circled the shareholder rights clause." "It's unusual for a company at this stage of pre-sale preparation," Nina said. The dilution provisions are drafted in a way that would allow a third-party acquirer to reduce minority shareholder value post-close. If the son has shares, he may not have read this carefully. Wei Shu was quiet for a moment. The elevator descended. "Note that," he said. "Draft a memo. Don't send it. Just draft it and leave it in the Hengfeng folder." She drafted it that evening and the evening after, and across the following 2 weeks, she drafted 4 additional analytical memos that she did not send on matters ranging from the structure of Hengfeng's subsidiary entities to a cross-reference discrepancy in the company's registered charges. She left all of them in the folder. She said nothing about them in meetings. She did not mention them to her desk neighbor Theo, who was running a straightforward commercial matter and would not have found them interesting. She waited. Anit Weishu called her into his office on a Thursday. His office was on the 15th floor, which had better views and slightly warmer lighting, and the particular ambient temperature of a place where consequential decisions were regularly made. He had her memos open on his screen, all 4 of them, and he read through them in silence for 4 minutes while she sat in the chair across from his desk and did not fidget. "You drafted these on your own time," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Why?" "Because they were accurate," she said. "And because if they weren't, I wanted to find that out before anyone else saw them." He turned in his chair and looked at the city through his window, which had a full view, unobstructed, all the way to the river. "Where did you study?" he said. She told him. She told him also about her undergraduate thesis, which had been on minority shareholder protection mechanisms in PRC company law, and which she had written 3 years ago in this timeline, and which she could discuss from memory with the fluency of someone who had spent the intervening years applying its principles to actual casework. Weishu turned back from the window. "I'm going to bring you into the Hengfeng structural analysis more formally," he said. "This means longer hours and less interesting work in the short term. The payoff is at the other end." "I understand," Nina said. "If you're not curious about the payoff." "I know what it is," she said. "Competence compound interest. The longer the runway, the larger the return." Weishu looked at her for a moment with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but was attentive in the specific way of people who are reassessing their estimate of someone. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." She left his office and walked back to her desk and sat down and allowed herself, for exactly 12 seconds, to feel the particular satisfaction of a thing correctly done. Not triumphant satisfaction, the quieter kind, the kind that comes from having placed a correct bet after long calculation. Then she opened the next document in her queue and began reading. That evening she called her father. Richard Liang answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he was not in a meeting and not with Helen, both of which conditions she had learned to read through call patterns before she'd been old enough to articulate why she was reading them. His voice had the slightly guarded quality it always carried when she called. Not cold, but calibrated. He had never been cold to Nina. He had been calibrated. There was a difference, and the difference was precisely the distance between a man who did not love his daughter and a man who loved her in a way that required managing. "Nina," he said. Dad," she said. She was standing at her apartment window with the city going dark below. "I've been thinking about Mom." A pause. Measured, not reactive. "What about her?" "About her business interests," Nina said. "I found an old photo of her at one of the early Liang property events. It got me thinking. Did she have any formal involvement in the company when they started out?" The pause this time was longer. "Your mother was very supportive of the company in the early years," he said. "Oh, of course," Nina said. She kept her voice soft, inquiring, the voice of a daughter who is curious in an uncomplicated way. I've been thinking about her a lot lately, and I realized I know so little about that part of her life, what she was doing professionally." "She was primarily focused on raising you," her father said. "She wasn't well for the last few years, as you know." "I know," Nina said. "I miss her." This was true. It was also useful. But there was a specific texture to grief that she had learned her father could not easily navigate. He could handle pragmatic demands, financial requests, strategic discussions, but genuine emotional statement made him retreat slightly into a more tender version of himself, one that was less guarded and more prone to inadvertent disclosure. "I think about her too," he said, and his voice was marginally softer. She always talked about the company like it was something she and you built together," Nina said. "I think she was proud of it." Another pause. She had pressed slightly too directly, she judged. He was recalibrating. "She was supportive," he said again. "Your mother was a wonderful woman, Nina." "She was," Nina said. "I know. I'd like to understand more about her when you have time." "Of course," he said. "Come for dinner on Sunday." Helen's making her lamb dish." Nina agreed to Sunday dinner and ended the call and stood at the window for a while in the dark with the phone in her hand. In the original articles of incorporation, her mother had been listed as co-founder with a 49% ownership stake. The company had been started with joint capital, her mother's inheritance from her own father, Nina's maternal grandfather, a Shanghai printer who had left his daughter 2 apartments in the Xuhui district, and a cash account. Richard had brought the business contacts and the development expertise. Faye had brought the capital. It was a straightforward equity split for a genuine joint venture. The company was now worth, in 2017, approximately 800 million yuan in assets. 49% of that had belonged to Nina's mother. Nina had not been told about this when she was 9 and her mother died. She had not been told about it when she was 16 and the filing was amended. She had not been told about it at any subsequent point in her life, including the points at which her father was expressing, with apparent sincerity, his wish that she be financially independent, and his pride in her professional accomplishments, and his regret that the family dynamics were sometimes complicated. She had found out at 29, by accident, and she had done nothing with it because she had not yet understood what she could do with it, and because the stress of understanding what had happened was one of the contributing factors to the cardiac condition that her doctors had been monitoring for 2 years, and which had killed her at 31. She was 24 now. She knew an estate attorney. His name was James Fong, and he was not, in this current year, anyone she had yet met. She had met him at 28, at a legal conference where he had delivered a presentation on the recovery of improperly divested estate assets under PRC inheritance law that she had attended because the topic was technically relevant to a case she'd been working and not because she'd had any personal interest in it. He was precise, dry-humored, and possessed of a comprehensive working knowledge of the specific intersection between corporate law and estate law that governed situations in which company ownership stakes were transferred, amended, or eliminated without the knowledge or consent of their rightful heirs. He had an office on the Bund. She knew this because she'd sent him a referral 3 years later in her first life, and she still had the address somewhere in the residual geography of her professional memory. She would not contact him yet. Not at 24, not before she had the documentation organized and the strategy structured. Going to an attorney with a half-formed case was the amateur's move. It wasted time and allowed the opposing side to see movement before you were ready. She would gather, she would document, she would build the case the way she'd learned to build every other case, from the foundation up, with the patience of someone who understood that durability required time. The next 14 months were the most disciplined of her life, which was saying something because the previous version of her life had also required considerable discipline. It had simply been the kind aimed at survival rather than strategy. She worked on the Hangfeng matter with Wei Shu, and she was good at it in the visible, demonstrable way that builds a professional reputation, not the quiet, invisible way that earns you appreciation without advancement. She drafted briefs that were technically precise and strategically aware, and she presented them in meetings with the concise manner of someone who has decided that their work should speak, rather than their personality. And she was recognized for this in the incremental way of institutions. A better assignment here, a senior mention there, the slight shift in how people addressed her in hallways. She also, in the same period, opened a dedicated file on her personal laptop that she kept on a password-protected drive and which contained the following materials, assembled systematically over those 14 months. The original 2003 Articles of Incorporation, accessed through the Company Registry Public Database. The 2009 filing amendment, similarly accessed. A detailed analysis of the capital contribution records available in the first 2 years of Liang Properties public filings, which showed a pattern of capital investment consistent with a dual contributor structure. A timeline of Fei Wuliang's documented assets, reconstructed from publicly available probate records and supplemented by documents Nina had located through patient, methodical research in the municipal archive, where property transactions over 15 years old were stored in physical files that nobody looked at unless they had a specific reason to. Bore 3 photographs of Fei Wuliang at Liang property events, sourced from a business magazine archive from 2002 and 2003, in which Fei was identified in captions as a company founder. A research memo on the specific provisions of PRC inheritance law governing the transmission of equity stakes in privately held companies, with particular attention to the conditions under which a posthumous claim could be filed on behalf of an heir who had been unaware of their entitlement. Well, she did not share any of this with her father. She did not share it with Cora, with whom she maintained a relationship of carefully managed surface warmth, responsive to messages, available for the family occasions that her father requested her attendance at, present but not informative. She did not share it with Marcus Chen, whom she was, in this timeline, in the early stages of dating. She did not share it with anyone, and she did not hurry it. And she did not allow herself to feel anything strongly about it, except the kind of focused, even-tempered determination that is the only sustainable fuel for a long operation. She had, however, made one change to the original timeline that required monitoring. In her first life, she had introduced Marcus Chen to her family at 25, approximately 14 months from this present moment. She had brought him to a Sunday dinner at the family home in Suhui, was where Helen had been gracious, and her father had been quietly approving, and Cora had been warm in a way that Nina had interpreted as sisterly, and which she now understood was reconnaissance. Marcus was good-looking in an uncomplicated way, professionally successful, charming in social settings, with the practiced ease of someone who had been told from early adolescence that his charm was his best feature, and had made peace with building on it. He was also, Nina had eventually understood, as a man of moderate integrity and immoderate susceptibility, susceptible to attention, to flattery, to the particular kind of reflected importance that Cora offered people she wanted, which was the feeling of being perceived as exceptional by someone who appeared to have high standards. In this timeline, Nina was not going to introduce Marcus to her family at 25. This was not because she still had feelings about Marcus. She did not. Whatever she had felt for him had burned away along with everything else in the clarity of dying, and what remained was not grief or anger, but something colder and more informative, the recognition that she had been a person who could be drawn to a man like Marcus, which told her something specific about the version of herself she had been at 25, and which she was in the current process of correcting. She was managing the relationship with the mild attentiveness of someone performing a necessary maintenance task. She would end it, cleanly, in approximately 4 months, when a natural point of divergence appeared in the form of a job opportunity that Marcus would receive in Shenzhen, and which in the original timeline she had encouraged him to decline because she hadn't wanted the distance. This time she would encourage him to take it. He would. He would be grateful. He would eventually, she knew, be happy there. He was a decent man who was best served by distance from the Liang family. The Sunday dinners at her father's house were the operational center of the 14 months. They were also, if she was being precise with herself, the most taxing part. Not because of her father. Richard Liang at 62 was a man in the late stage of having made his choices. Living with the architecture of them in the way of people who have committed too fully to a structure to examine its foundations with any comfort. He was not cruel to Nina. He was not dismissive. He was, she thought, genuinely fond of her in a way that had simply been insufficient to protect her. And the distinction between genuine insufficient fondness and its performed version was something she had spent years learning to hold without bitterness, because bitterness required ongoing expenditure of energy that she needed elsewhere. It was Helen who required the most attention at Sunday dinners. Helen Liang was 60 and very thin and wore her intelligence in the specific way of women who have spent their lives being underestimated and have learned to perform the underestimation deliberately, as a tactic. She had warm eyes and a careful voice and an ability to make you feel, in conversation, that you were the most interesting person in the room. Which Nina now understood was the social equivalent of the shareholder dilution clause she had flagged for Wei Shu. Technically structured to appear beneficial while functionally redistributing your standing. She had spent years admiring Helen. That was the most efficient summary of it. She had admired what she now understood to be a performance. The warmth, the inclusive language around the family table, also the way Helen had of drawing both Nina and Cora into conversations in a manner that appeared perfectly balanced, and that required, she understood now, considerable skill to maintain while running an entirely different agenda in the background. It was like watching a conductor keep two orchestras moving in opposite directions with the same baton. Technically, remarkable. Entirely in service of a piece no one had consented to perform. At Sunday dinners, Helen served food and asked thoughtful questions about Nina's work, and made gentle inquiries about Marcus, and occasionally, and apparently casually, mentioned things Cora was doing that suggested Cora's life was unfolding in a direction of increasing consequence, and requiring, in its unfolding, various forms of family support that were briefly described and never directly requested. The mention would be made. The table would absorb it. Sub Richard Liang would nod with the expression of a man noting a budget line item. Nina would ask a follow-up question of mild interest that produced further detail. And the detail, assembled over successive dinners, built a picture. Cora's education required investment. Cora's career launch required contacts. Cora's relationship with Edward Park was significant, and the family should be supportive of it. Cora's future was being actively constructed with the precision of a project plan. While in the family, meaning Richard's resources and Nina's social proximity to the professional world Cora wished to enter, was the construction material. Nina had not seen this the first time she had heard these conversations as family news. Interesting, slightly more frequent than she'd have chosen, but the ordinary texture of a family with an active younger member being enthusiastically supported. She had been, she thought now, always remarkably obliging about providing professional introductions when Helen asked for them in Cora's behalf. 4 introductions over 3 years, all genuine professionals who had taken the meetings and spent the time and who had done so, in part, because they were doing Nina a favor, which meant they were depositing the goodwill in Helen and Cora's account while drawing it from Nina's. She was not going to provide those introductions in this timeline. Nina listened to all of this and ate the lamb dish, which was genuinely excellent, and responded with calibrated warmth and minimal information. Cora herself was 21 in this timeline, a graduate student in business administration at a Shanghai university, living partly at home, funded by a combination of family money and a scholarship from an industry association that Nina now understood had been arranged through Helen's professional network. She was beautiful in the way their shared father's features produced beauty in women, angular and refined, with dark eyes. And she moved through the family space with the unexamined ease of someone who has never been required to account for their presence. She did not seem, at 21, to be particularly interested in Nina. She asked Nina questions about work with the polite curiosity of someone who found the topic mildly relevant to their general education. She borrowed Nina's umbrella once without asking, and returned it without mention. There was one dinner in the 7th month that required more careful navigation than the others. It was in October. The weather had shifted into the particular dry cold of Shanghai autumn, the kind that came on quickly and made the light different. Flatter, more direct, the way light behaves when the air is clear and the angle is lower. Helen had made the lamb dish and also a cold vegetable preparation that Richard Liang liked and which she always made when she was managing him toward something, which Nina recognized now the way she had not then. Cora had brought Edward Park to dinner. He was 31, well-dressed in the way of men whose families have had money long enough that the dressing is unconsidered, and he had the easy manner of someone whose social confidence is structural rather than performed. He had been, in Nina's first life, the person who organized the financial vehicle through which the portfolio transfer was eventually executed. He had also been, before that, and perhaps more relevantly, the person with whom Cora had spent the summer, apparently, based on the way they occupied space together, with the practiced negotiation of people who have already navigated each other's habits. Nina watched him across the dinner table with the attention of someone taking a deposition. He was not strictly, a malicious person. This was one of the more uncomfortable conclusions she had arrived at over years of thinking about the original timeline. Edward Park was a man who operated within the logic available to him and who had never been required to develop logic outside it. The available logic was, favorable structures benefit those positioned to take advantage of them. He had been positioned, always by family money and professional network, and a relationship with Cora that ran directly through the Liang family's inner orbit, to take advantage of the planned portfolio transfer. He had taken advantage of it. He had not manufactured the opportunity. He had simply arrived in the room where the opportunity was and extended his hand. He said over the lamb dish, "You're in corporate law, Nina? Wei Shu's group at Qian?" "Yes," Nina said. "Wei Shu does solid work," he said. "My family's used his group on a few matters. The Pengcheng refinancing, a couple of years back." "I know the matter," Nina said. She said nothing further. He looked at her with the mild interest of someone who expected more conversation and had not received it. "You're focused on property law?" "Commercial work with estate intersections," she said. "It's a developing area." He nodded with the expression of a person who files information into broad categories. "Useful combination," he said. And Helen moved the conversation elsewhere, smoothly, the way she moved everything. Richard Liang asked Edward Park about his family's current projects. Cora listened with the expression of a woman who is satisfied with how the room is arranged. The dinner proceeded. Afterward, in the hallway while retrieving her coat, Cora said quietly, "Edward is very interested in property development opportunities. If you come across anything at the firm that might be relevant." "I can't discuss client matters outside the firm," Nina said. "You know that." Cora looked at her for a moment. Her expression was not unfriendly. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. "Of course," she said. "I wasn't asking about specifics. Just if there's ever a chance to connect him with the right people." "I'll keep it in mind," Nina said. She would not keep it in mind. She put on her coat and said goodbye to her father, who hugged her briefly and said he was glad she'd come, and she thanked Helen for the lamb and walked out into the October evening, down the front steps of the Shui house with its pale stone facade and its carefully maintained garden, and she walked to the corner and waited for the car she'd ordered. The air smelled of cold leaves and something cooking from the restaurant 2 doors down. She stood in it with her hands in her coat pockets and thought about Edward Park's extended hand and the logic that had produced it, and the fact that the logic was currently under construction. Specifically, the Liang property asset structure that constituted the floor on which that logic rested was in the process of being fundamentally altered without Edward Park's knowledge or Cora's. She was not doing this to Cora. She was not doing this at Cora. She was doing it for her mother. And the fact that it would intercept a transfer of assets that had been planned in Cora's direction was an outcome rather than an objective. This distinction mattered to her. She had spent considerable time ensuring that it was genuine and not merely self-protective, that she was not dressing a retaliatory motive in more dignified language. She was reasonably confident that it was genuine. The claim existed before any specific thought of its effects on Cora's plans. The injury was to her mother's estate, not to her own competition with her sister, and the repair was to the estate, not to any balance sheet of grievances. This was true. It was also true that the outcomes would be indistinguishable to an outside observer. She got in the car. Nina watched Cora and did not confront her, and attended the dinners she was required to attend, and conducted the family relationships as operational rather than emotional exercises, and she built the file. In month 9, the Hangfeng matter concluded. The restructuring was completed with terms that protected Victor Shen's minority interests and included a clause that Wei Shu said afterward, in a brief moment of professional candor that Nina had rarely seen from him, had been Nina's contribution. A specific protective mechanism for the subsidiary entities that had come directly from her analytical memo on the registered charges discrepancy. Victor Shen had asked at the closing meeting, which associate had worked on the subsidiary analysis? Wei Shu had said Nina's name. Victor Shen had looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of a man who has spent 40 years doing deals and has learned to catalog the people worth knowing. "Liang?" he said. "Any relation to Richard Liang at Liang Property?" "He's my father," she said. Victor Shen's expression was unreadable. "I've known your father for 20 years, he said. "He's a careful man." "He is," Nina said. "Yeah, you're careful too," Victor Shen said, in a different way. She did not pursue this. She thanked him professionally and moved on. And afterward in the elevator, Wei Shu said nothing, but in the silence she heard the thing he wasn't saying, which was noted. In month 11, she met James Fong for the first time. She arranged it not at a conference, but through a professional introduction. which she engineered by identifying a matter at Kean and Partners that had an estate law component and suggesting to Wei Shu that external specialist counsel might strengthen the analysis. Wei Shu agreed. He asked her to identify someone. She provided James Fong's name and a brief profile of his practice. Wei Shu reviewed it and said he looked suitable. James Fong was 48, compact, with close-cut gray at his temples and the focused, slightly compressed manner of a person who thinks quickly and speaks only when he has something worth saying. He arrived at the Kean and Partners conference room precisely on time and shook hands with the efficiency of a man who has shaken enough hands to have reduced the gesture to its essential function. Nina sat across from him at the table and did her job, which was to provide the factual background for the matter under discussion, and she did this with the crisp competence that her months on the Hangfeng matter had sharpened. And at the end of the meeting, James Fong said, to the room in general, but looking at her specifically, "The analysis of the trust structure is correct. The question is whether the settler's original intent can be proven at this stage." He looked at her. "Can it?" "Yes," Nina said. "The 2004 correspondence establishes it. I'll flag the specific documents." "Good," he said. How afterward he lingered in the corridor while Wei Shu took a call, and Nina was gathering her materials at the conference room table, and he stood in the doorway and said, "You're Richard Liang's daughter." She looked up. "People keep establishing that," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly, but adjacent to it. "I worked on a matter adjacent to Liang property once," he said. "Some years ago, estate-related." She felt very still inside. "Adjacent how?" "I was representing a creditor. I crossed paths with the Wu company's structure in the due diligence. There were some unusual features." He paused. "I'll find you in the system and send you the flagged documents from our side." He left. She stood at the conference room table for a moment, with her hand resting on her stack of materials, and thought, he knows something. He has known something. He worked on something years ago and saw the edges of it and never had a reason to follow up. Oh, she was going to give him a reason. She made an appointment with James Fong's office that week, on her personal time as an individual client, and not on Kean and Partners' behalf. She brought the file she had been building for 11 months. His office on the Bund was what she remembered it to be. Ordered, functional, without the ornamental excess that some attorneys use to signal success. He had books on shelves that looked read rather than displayed, and a long window overlooking the river, and a desk cleared to a working surface. She put the file in front of him and said, "I need you to read this and tell me whether it constitutes a viable claim." He read for 20 minutes. She sat across from him and looked at the river through his window and was very quiet. When he finished, he placed the last document face down on the stack with the care of a man who has just encountered something that requires different handling than he'd anticipated. "Where did you get the 2003 incorporation documents?" he said. "Public registry," she said. "They've never been sealed." "The 2009 amendment?" "Same." "The capital contribution analysis?" "Extrapolated from the public filings. It's an approximation, but the methodology is documented." He was quiet for a moment. "You're 24, yes." "You built this file on your own time?" "Yes." "Why now?" he said. "You would have been 16 when the amendment was filed. And you could theoretically have pursued this earlier." "I didn't know earlier," she said. "I only found the original filing recently." This was technically accurate. She did not add that the finding had occurred in a different version of her life. He turned in his chair and looked at the river. It was a gray day. The water was the same flat, opaque silver as the sky. "The claim is viable," he said. "Under Article 26 of the company law, in conjunction with the estate provisions applicable to the original shareholding, a posthumous equity claim on behalf of an heir can be filed where the divestiture was unauthorized, specifically where the filing amendment was executed without legal notice to or consent of the natural heirs." He paused. "You're the natural heir. Your mother's estate passed to you as sole surviving issue." "I know, Hen," Nina said. "Oh, the 49% stake that was removed in 2009. If the original structure holds, its current equivalent value in Liang property development is substantial." "I know," Nina said again. "Your father will contest this aggressively." "I know that too." He turned back from the river. His expression had settled into something that was neither sympathy nor calculation, but held elements of both. "I'll need to review the methodology of the capital contribution analysis," he said. "If that holds. Oh, and if we can establish that the amendment filing was executed in breach of the estate fiduciary obligations, which, given that Helen Liang witnessed the document and had a direct financial interest in its outcome, is arguable, then we're looking at a restoration claim, not just a damages claim. The distinction matters. Restoration means the stake reverts. It doesn't just produce a payment." Nina looked at him steadily. "I understand the distinction," she said. He studied her for a moment. "I'll take the matter," he said. She left his office and walked along the Bund in the gray cold, with the river on her left moving slowly south. And she thought about her mother, not about the injustice, which was clarified and documented and now in the hands of a competent person, not about the strategy, which was laid out and was now moving through its natural sequence. She thought about Fei Wuliang, who had been 26 in 2003 when the company was founded, was 1 year younger than Nina was now, who had put her inheritance into something she and her husband were building together, and who had died at 38, without ever knowing, or perhaps, Nina thought, while knowing and being unable to act, that it had been taken back. She thought, "I am finishing something for you." Then she turned away from the river and went back to work. The following months had 2 operational tracks running in parallel. The first track was her career. Anne knew she had been assigned, in the wake of the Hengfeng matter, to the property group proper, a structural promotion that technically represented no change in title, but represented an enormous change in the quality and consequence of her work. She was working directly with Wei Shu now on a rotating basis across 3 ongoing matters. And the work required everything she had in terms of technical knowledge and analytical endurance, and the particular kind of client management skill that is less about charm and more about making people feel that their interests are being handled with precision. She was good at it. She had been good at it in her first life, too. But the advancement had been slower then, impeded by the usual friction of being a young woman in a firm where the structural assumptions about trajectory were built around a different archetype, and impeded also by the specific friction of being Richard Liang's daughter in a professional environment where that surname was known, which created a set of unspoken calculations about her motivation and her need that she'd had to consistently disprove through work product. She knew how to disprove it faster now. The second track was the claim. James Fong moved with the methodical speed of a man who was thorough by nature and urgent by professional obligation. He filed a preliminary inquiry with the company registry within 3 weeks of their first meeting. He engaged a forensic accountant, a woman named Lin Shu, who turned out to be quiet, exact, and possessed of an apparently congenital suspicion of round numbers in financial filings, to review the capital contribution analysis and, where necessary, expand it. Lin Shu came back in 6 weeks with a finding. The capital contribution analysis was conservative. In Fei Wuliang's contribution to the initial capitalization of Liang Property Development, Mahedu had been not merely the sum recoverable from the known inheritance capital, but also a property asset, one of the 2 Zhuhui district apartments inherited from her father, that had been transferred to Liang Property's balance sheet in 2003 and listed in the company's asset register not as a capital contribution, but as a loan. The distinction between a loan and a capital contribution was not trivial. If it was a loan, Fei was a creditor and the estate had a debt claim. If it was a capital contribution, Fei was an equity holder and the estate had an ownership claim. The documentation from 2003, examined carefully, showed clearly that no loan agreement had ever been executed. The transfer had been recorded as a contribution in the company's internal records and had been reclassified as a loan in a document dated January 2010, 3 months after the filing amendment removing Fei's name. James Fong read Lin Shu's report and said in his compressed way, "That's the weapon." The legal filing was made in November of the following year, approximately 13 months after Nina had walked into James Fong's office. Nina was now 25 and 3/4 of a standard years into a trajectory that, even to herself, felt different in texture from the first version, less subject to the erosions and misdirections that had characterized her original path, more taut, like a line under controlled tension. Richard Liang called her the morning after the filing was served on his company. She was at her desk in the Kian and Partners office, at what was now a window-side position that she had occupied for 4 months, and which she intended to occupy for considerably longer. He called her personal number, not her work line, which told her he had decided this was a family conversation. She answered on the second ring. "Nina," he said. There was no greeting. Suppose the word was not inflected as warmth or anger, but as something more fundamental. The sound of a man who has just understood that a thing he believed he had secured is not in fact secure. "Dad," she said, "you've filed a legal claim against my company?" "My attorney has filed a restoration claim on behalf of my mother's estate," she said, "against the unauthorized amendment to the original Articles of Incorporation." The silence was longer than any of the previous silences. When outside her window the city was bright and cold. A plane was visible, very small, tracking across the upper right corner of the sky. "I don't understand why you would do this," he said. She could hear the genuine component in this. He didn't fully understand. He had spent so many years managing the situation through omission and redirection that he had, she thought, arrived at a state where the original act had been narratively absorbed, filed away in the part of the mind where people store the things they have decided not to think about. He was not, in this moment, performing confusion. He actually didn't understand. "Because it's mine," she said, "and it's been mine since I was 9 years old. And I've spent 16 years not knowing that, and now I know it, and I'm not going to continue not knowing it." "Nina, I'm not going to discuss the substance with you," she said. "That's what the attorneys are for. That's what I wanted to tell you myself, before Helen told you what to think about it. I wanted you to know it came from me." Another silence. She waded through it without filling it. "This will be very difficult for the family," he said finally. His voice had lost the administrative quality and found something underneath it, something older, more genuine, that she recognized as the voice he used when he was actually talking to her rather than managing her. "I know," she said. "For your relationship with Cora." "My relationship with Cora is not your concern in this context," she said. "Or mine. Dad, I'm not doing this to the family. I'm doing this for my mother, for what she built and what was taken from her before she could leave it to me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was very small and that she had never heard from him before, "She would have wanted you to have it." "Yes," Nina said. She would have." She ended the call and set the phone down on her desk and pressed her palms flat against the desk surface and breathed for a moment with the specific, careful breathing she had developed over the past months as a management tool for the moments when the emotional reality of what she was doing became temporarily more acute than was useful. He knew, she thought. He had known, at some level, for 25 years that it was hers. He had allowed it to be taken anyway. She folded that knowledge up and put it in the part of her mind that was not relevant to the present work, and she went back to her screen. The legal process took 18 months. Richard Liang's attorneys filed 3 separate procedural challenges. James Fong defeated 2 of them on technical grounds, and rendered the third moot by introducing Lin Shu's reclassification finding, which reframed the claim from a pure equity matter to a combined equity and debt matter that significantly expanded the legal basis. Helen Liang was deposed. Her deposition lasted 4 hours, and Nina did not attend it, but James Fong's summary afterward was 3 words. She was excellent. "Excellent how?" Nina said. "Excellent at being a witness for us," he said. "Consistent denial of knowledge is only useful when the question is whether something happened. Well, when the question is what was done with it after, a consistent denial of knowledge is an admission. Cora did not appear in the proceedings directly. Her name appeared in documents, in the 2022 portfolio transfer that Nina had been tracking from her original timeline, which was now a future event that the legal process was going to prevent or restructure depending on how the restoration claim resolved. James Fong was aware of the portfolio transfer as a downstream concern and had structured the claim specifically to address it. A restoration of the original equity stake would carry through to any subsequent transfer of assets derived from that stake, meaning the transfer to Cora and Edward Park could not be completed as structured without Nina's consent as a co-owner. In month 15 of the legal process, Richard Liang's attorneys requested a mediation. The mediation lasted 3 days. Then it was held at a neutral venue, a conference facility on the western side of the city with windows that faced a garden and meeting rooms that were designed to feel less adversarial than a courtroom by the expedient of having softer chairs and a catered lunch service. Nina attended all 3 days with James Fong and Lin Shu, and she sat across the table from her father and his legal team, and she was dressed in a suit that she had bought herself, and that was well made, and that fit correctly, and that had not been borrowed, observed, or coveted by anyone. The first day was procedural. Both sides presented their formal positions. Richard Liang's attorney, a careful and a quiet man named Chen Wei, who had been Liang Properties' outside counsel for a decade, and who had the expression throughout of someone performing a duty that he found professionally distasteful, articulated the company's position that the 2009 amendment had been a clerical correction to reflect the actual ownership structure following Fei Wu Liang's death, and that the posthumous claim was therefore without merit, because the amendment had merely formalized a reality rather than created one. And James Fong presented the counterposition with the dry precision of a man who has spent 30 years watching other attorneys confuse presentation with substance. He put 3 documents on the table. The first was the original articles of incorporation with both names. The second was the capital contribution analysis, showing Fei's property asset incorrectly classified as a loan 7 years after her death. The third was a letter, a private letter, all found in the municipal archive during Nina's initial research, written by Fei Wu Liang to her attorney in 2001, before the company was founded, describing her plan to contribute her inheritance capital to the joint venture in exchange for a 49% ownership position. The letter had never been addressed to Richard. It was a personal record. It had no legal standing in itself. What it had was clarity, the specific, unmistakable clarity of a person describing their understanding of an arrangement in their own words, before any dispute existed and therefore with no motive to distort. Richard Liang looked at the letter. He looked at it for a long time. His attorney leaned over and said something to him quietly. Richard Liang shook his head almost imperceptibly, and the attorney leaned back. Day 1 ended. That evening, Nina ate alone at a restaurant near the conference facility, a small place with wooden tables and a specials board on a chalkboard and the smell of garlic and soy from the kitchen. She ordered the fish. She drank 1 glass of wine. She watched the other tables with the detached interest of someone who has temporarily exited one world and has not yet re-entered it. James Fong had said, before they separated for the night, "Your father knows." "He's always known," Nina said. "Well, yes," James Fong said. "But there's a difference between knowing in the way people manage their private conscience and knowing it in a room where it's on the table in front of you." She had thought about this over the fish and the wine. There was a version of this day, the day her mother's contribution had been laid out in documentation, made undeniable, placed in a room with her father, that would have undone her at 25. At 25, she had wanted, more than she'd admitted to herself, for her father to look at the evidence of what had happened and choose her, not the claim, her, to demonstrate in some clarifying moment that he understood which way his choices had run and was prepared to acknowledge it. She was 27 now. She did not need the clarifying moment. She needed the correct legal resolution, and she was going to get it regardless of what her father felt when he looked at the letter. Oh, and both things could be true simultaneously. She could want her father to see, and she could not require him to. She finished the wine and went back to the hotel and slept without difficulty. Helen attended on day 2. She arrived in a cream-colored jacket and low heels and sat beside Richard Liang with the composed assurance of a woman who has prepared for a room and believes her preparation is superior to whatever the room intends to do to her. She looked at Nina once, directly, and when she sat down, a look of perhaps 3 seconds duration that contained, as near as Nina could analyze it, a precise and complete reassessment. Not hostility, not the warmth either, just assessment. The look of someone who has been operating on one set of assumptions and has just had them revised. Nina looked back with the steadiness she had been building for 3 years. Helen's deposition answers on day 2 were, as James Fong had predicted, a gift. Out her consistent position. that she had not known about the capital contribution structure, that she had signed the 2009 amendment in her capacity as a witness without understanding its implications, that the reclassification of the property asset as a loan had been a decision made entirely at the company level without her involvement, was not provably false at any specific point. It was, however, structurally incoherent. Slaw's a woman with 4 years of experience as a paralegal in a corporate filing office who had reviewed the original incorporation documents as part of the natural due diligence of marrying into the company and who had witnessed the amendment 9 months after a document reclassifying a founding asset had been generated. That woman's ignorance required a specific and generous interpretation of her professional competence that Lin Shu's supplementary report made very difficult to sustain. Oh, James Fong did not make speeches about it. He asked careful questions in a mild tone. He thanked Helen for her time. He let the documents do what documents, when correctly assembled, will always do: speak without requiring interpretation. Helen Lang was not in the room on day 3. The resolution reached at the end of day 3 was this: a formal acknowledgement by Liang Property Development of the validity of the original 2003 equity structure and the unauthorized nature of the 2009 amendment, and a restoration of an equivalent 49% stake in the company's current structure, adjusted for dilution events since the original filing and calculated by Lin Shu's methodology. A cash payment representing the value of the improperly classified property loan from 2003, compounded over the intervening years at the market rate. A restructuring of the planned 2022 portfolio transfer, the one that had not yet occurred in this timeline, to require co-owner consent, which effectively meant that no significant asset movement could happen without Nina's knowledge and approval. The total value of the resolution, across the equity stake and the cash component, was approximately 412 million yuan. James Fong, reviewing the final documents in the conference room after the Liang property team had filed out, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother's attorney, if she had one in 2009, I should have caught this." "She died in 2002, Nina said. "There was no attorney." He nodded. "I know. I'm saying it for the record. What happened here was not obscure. It was straightforward. Someone simply counted on no one looking." "Yes," Nina said. There was a particular quality of silence in the emptied conference room, the silence of a space that has held something consequential and now holds its aftermath. The catered lunch sat untouched at the far end of the table. So the garden through the window was going gold in the afternoon light. Nina looked at the stack of signed documents and felt briefly and precisely what she recognized from the first life as grief. Not grief for the resolution. The resolution was correct and complete. Grief for the years, for the 25 years between the founding and this room. For her mother, who had put her inheritance and her trust into a company she believed was jointly owned, and had died before the joint ownership became something that could be contested. For the 9-year-old girl who had attended her mother's funeral without knowing that the inheritance her mother would have given her was already, in someone's accounting, allocated elsewhere. For the version of herself who had found the original filing at 29 and not understood what she was looking at in time to act. She held the grief for exactly as long as it required, which was perhaps 90 seconds, and then she set it down. "I'll file the registration notice today," James Fong said. "Yes," Nina said. "Do that." She signed the final documents with the pen she had brought from her desk, a plain black pen, nothing ceremonial about it. Outside the conference facility, the city was in the particular warm light of a late spring evening. The kind of light that turns ordinary buildings gold and makes the streets feel like something from a different and better version of themselves. Nina stood outside for a moment before getting into the car James Fong had arranged. Her phone had a message from Cora. She read it. It said, "I don't understand why you did this to us." She put the phone in her bag. She did not reply. She got in the car. The drive back across the city took 40 minutes in the early evening traffic. And for most of it she watched the city go by outside the window. The elevated highways, the glass towers with their lit rectangles, the older neighborhoods with their lower buildings and their sidewalk trees, the river briefly visible before the road curved away from it. She was 27 years old. She had been here before, In this city, at this age, in a life that had proceeded from this point in a direction that was now entirely and permanently unavailable. A note in that first life she had been, at 27, in the early stages of a relationship with Marcus Chen that she had believed was going well. She had been a mid-level associate at a firm that valued her work without particularly advocating for her advancement. She had been managing her family relationships with the exhausting good faith effort of a person who has decided that family is something you maintain regardless of what it costs. Oh, because the alternative is a kind of aloneness you have not yet decided you can tolerate. She was not, in this life, managing family relationships. She was conducting them. The distinction was operational and clarifying and produced, in her, a steadiness that she recognized as what the first version of herself had been trying to approximate through effort and goodwill and had never quite reached. She thought about the boots. She thought about the donation receipt folded behind her transit card in her wallet. Date-stamped, itemized, signed by the volunteer at the donation center who had recorded Enilang and moved on to the next person in the queue without any understanding of what the transaction meant. There was a version of this story, she thought, in which the boots were the center of it, in which the act of her sister taking them was the wound, and everything that followed was the recovery from that wound. So a story about things taken and reclaimed, about possessions as proxies for selfhood, about the satisfaction of getting back what was yours. That was not the story she had been living. The boots were irrelevant. They had always been irrelevant. The things that Cora took from her, the watch, the earrings, the jackets, eventually the fiancé, eventually the goodwill of a father who had learned over decades to rebalance his affections according to the domestic gravity Helen managed with professional consistency. None of those things were the wound. They were the symptoms. The wound was something that had happened before Cora could walk, when a woman named Fei Wu had put her inheritance into a company she built with her husband and had died before she could pass it to her daughter. When the gap her death created had been filled by something that was not grief, but was very good at looking like it. Nina had not reclaimed the boots. She had donated them before Cora ever had the opportunity to notice them. That was the difference. Not retrieval, preemption. You do not fight for the thing that is taken. You remove the thing before the taking can occur, and then you go and address the original source of the problem. And you do it with documentation and legal standing and a forensic accountant and 18 months of patient, methodical, unglamorous work. The car stopped in front of her building. The driver wished her a good evening. She thanked him and went inside. Her apartment was on the 31st floor. She had moved here at 26. All earlier in this timeline than she had managed in the first one, because the resolution of the Hengfeng matter had accelerated her standing at the firm, and her standing had accelerated her compensation, and her compensation had given her options she had used with the same deliberateness she applied to everything else. The apartment had windows that opened fully. It had a landlord who returned calls within 24 hours. Means it had a kitchen that was large enough to use as a kitchen rather than as a storage space with a stove in it. It had a shoe rack by the door that held 5 pairs. She looked at it as she took off her jacket. 5 pairs. Work heels in 2 colors. Walking shoes, running shoes, a clean pair of leather flats she'd bought the week before to replace the ones she'd donated 2.5 years ago. Sufficient. Nothing decorative, nothing to be noticed, borrowed, or reclaimed by anyone. She put her jacket in the wardrobe and sat down at the small dining table with her laptop and the folder of documents that James Fong had sent ahead of the mediation conclusion for her personal records. She opened the folder and began to read. There was a full inventory of the assets returning to her, the equity position documents, the cash settlement schedule, the restructured terms of the planned portfolio transfer. There was also, at the back, a document she hadn't requested, and James Fong had included without comment, a copy of the original 2003 Articles of Incorporation before any amendment, with the 2 names listed side by side as co-founders, Richard Jianliang, Fei Wuliang. She looked at her mother's name for a long time. Fei Wuliang had been an ordinary woman in the way that thoroughness is ordinary. Careful, intelligent, as with the particular competence of someone who does not announce themselves, but builds things that last. She had married a man who appreciated her capital more fully then he appreciated her and had not lived long enough to discover the depth of that distinction. She had left a daughter who had spent 20 years not knowing what she was owed and 7 years of a second life figuring out how to claim it. Nina closed the folder. She opened a new document on her laptop and wrote a single line. As it was addressed to James Fong for filing with the company registry to formalize her position as co-owner of record. The line read, "Please proceed with the registration of Anna Ling as equity holder per the restored articles of incorporation, with immediate effect." She sent it. Then she closed the laptop and went to make dinner. In the hallway of the building, 11 floors below, the mailboxes were arranged in a neat grid, and her slot, 31F, contained, she would discover the next morning, a letter from her father, not from his attorneys. From him, in his own handwriting on the company letterhead he had been using since before she was born. The red Liang property header faded slightly at the top, where the printer had been running low on ink. The letter said, "I should have given this to you myself a long time ago. I was afraid of what it would require me to admit. I don't ask you to forgive that. I only want you to know I understand it was wrong." Underneath that, in smaller letters, "Your mother would be glad." Nina read it at her kitchen table the next morning with her coffee, and she held it in her hands for a moment without moving, and then she put it in the folder with the rest of the documents, behind the original articles of incorporation, and she went to shower and dress for work. The week after the mediation conclusion, she received an email from Wei Shu, who was not a man given to ceremonial communication, which said only, "The Hengfeng client has requested you specifically for a new matter. Your availability?" She was available. The new matter was not about Victor Shen's company. It was a referral. Victor Shen had sent his attorney, and his attorney had a client. And the client had a property development dispute that required the specific intersection of corporate and estate law that Nina had, over the preceding 2 years, developed what Wei Shu was now calling, in internal meetings, saw in a distinctive practice area. She went to the first meeting on a Tuesday with her notepad and her work shoes, and the steadiness of someone who has no reason to perform anything other than what she actually is. The client was a woman about her own age, with a specific problem involving an inherited commercial property and a family trust that had been administered in bad faith. Nina listened to the problem. She understood the problem. She began asking questions. 2 hours later, the client said, "You're not like other attorneys." Nina considered this. "How so?" "You don't look like you're listening and thinking about something else," the client said. "You look like you're actually inside the problem." Nina thought about this. "I've had some experience," she said, "with problems of this kind." She did not specify whose problems. The case resolved cleanly in 4 months. Nina was 28 by then, running her own practice area within Wei Shu's group, though handling estate commercial intersection, matters with a reputation that had developed quietly and specifically through the mechanism of careful work done without announcement. She had 3 regular clients and a growing referral network, and a brief in 2 ongoing proceedings that James Fong was co-counsel on, and she had, somewhere in the accumulated months, got past the point at which survival and strategy were the same activity and arrived at something that was simply her life. Not a recovered life or a corrected one, but hers, built on the foundation she had been laying since the morning she woke up wrong and smelled the carnations and lay still and began to count backward. She did not think about Cora very often, not because the wound was resolved. It was, structurally, out in the sense that the legal architecture of the thing Cora had been positioned to inherit was now fundamentally different and could not be completed in the form it had originally taken, but also in a more fundamental sense. Cora was not the source. Cora had been positioned by Helen, by circumstances, by the particular family ecology that Richard Liang's choices had produced and maintained. Cora had moved within that ecology with the facility of someone who had been taught from very early to do so, and Nina had no particular interest in punishing her for that, because punishment required ongoing proximity, and ongoing proximity required ongoing expenditure of attention that she had better uses for. She had, however, also received through the business media a notice that Edward Park's investment group, which was the one through which Cora had been managing the planned portfolio transfer, had withdrawn from the transaction following the restructuring of its terms. Edward Park was, professionally, a man who required favorable deal terms to proceed. The restructured terms required Nina's consent for asset movement. Edward Park had apparently concluded that Nina's consent was not guaranteed, which was correct, and had withdrawn. Cora had sent 2 more messages in the year following the mediation. Neither asked anything specific. Both communicated a kind of suspended bewilderment, the message of someone who has not yet decided how to reframe the event they are experiencing. Nina had read both and not replied. Her father called her once a month now. So the calls were shorter than the old Sunday dinner conversations, but different in texture. Something in them had simplified since the letter. A complexity removed. He asked about her work, and she told him the parts that were relevant, and he said he was glad she was doing well, and she said she was. Helen's name came up less frequently. The Shu Hui family house came up less frequently. The Sunday dinners had stopped at some point in the preceding months without formal conclusion. The way things stop when no one schedules the next instance. On a Tuesday in late autumn, nearly 3 years after the morning she had woken up wrong, Nina took a box down from the top shelf of her bedroom closet and opened it. Inside were the documents she had assembled in the first 14 months. The originals, printed and organized in the way she'd organized them before James Fong had formalized the process. The public registry printouts. Past the photographs of her mother at the company events, the handwritten timeline, the research memo on inheritance law that she'd written at her kitchen table in the apartment with the half-opening window. She looked at the photographs for a long time. Fei Wu Liang at 30, at a construction site in what would become one of Liang Properties' first completed developments. She was wearing a hard hat and looking directly at the camera with an expression of uncomplicated attention. She was not posed. Although she was simply present, Nina put the photographs back in the box. She put the box back on the shelf. She went to her desk and opened her laptop to the document she'd been drafting, a legal brief for one of the estate commercial matters currently in her queue, and she began to read from where she'd left off, finding the thread of the argument and picking it up cleanly, the way you pick up a line you know how to hold. Her phone showed a message from James Fong. Registration confirmed. Registry updated as of today's date. You're on the record. She read it once. She put the phone face down on the desk. She went back to the brief. Outside, the city continued in its particular autumn register. The plane trees along the boulevard below her window releasing their leaves in the wind, the traffic moving at its usual pace, the light across the river going flat and silver as the afternoon ran down toward evening. A normal day, a Tuesday. And the kind of day that contains no singular event, but which is composed, in aggregate, of exactly the decisions that produce the life you are building. She wrote 2 more pages of the brief without stopping. Then she sent it, put on her coat, and went to get coffee from the place 2 blocks away where the barista knew her order and had it ready before she reached the counter, because she had been coming here every morning for a year, and she was, in small ways and large ones, a person who showed up consistently and was therefore known. She took her coffee to the window table. She drank it while it was still hot. When she was done, she went back to the office and got to work.